Fantasy sports can be dated back to the 1980s. It is said that a sports writer and his group of friends came up with the idea first in a restaurant. The first idea was to draft Major League Baseball players and start their own fantasy baseball league. They would keep track of stats throughout the season, and the player with the best stats would end up winning the league. Would end up winning, scoring the most points, and end up helping their team win the league. Although fantasy baseball was the first to exist in the fantasy world, it would be professional football that makes fantasy sports the billion-dollar industry that it is today. Fantasy football was created in 1984 when two men, Tom Kane Jr. and Cliff Charpentine, distributed the 1984 Fantasy Football Digest. This was the first time that the rules of fantasy football had been established. By 1988, it was estimated that about 500,000 people were already playing fantasy sports. By that time, many other publications and newspapers and magazines began to write about fantasy sports, which continued the growth of the sport itself. By the year 2003, the number of people that were playing fantasy sports was about 15 million. It is estimated that during this time, the average fantasy sports player was spending about $150 a year on fantasy sports. This was the year that fantasy sports really began to take off, and many sports publications began to hire writers specifically for fantasy sports. Even the National Football League themselves began to promote fantasy football by running commercials with current professional football players from that year. By 2007, the number of fantasy football players had nearly doubled to 29.9 million people in the US and Canada alone. Today, you can find a fantasy sports league for nearly any kind of sport: football, hockey, baseball, etc. Nearly 32 million Americans today are playing fantasy football, and they're spending about $467 per person, which equates to about $15 billion per year. Fantasy football is the most popular of all of fantasy sports. It is estimated that the fantasy football industry is worth anywhere from $40 to $70 billion. Since 2007, there has been an increase of about 60% by those who play fantasy sports. The top US sites that offer these services for fantasy sports would be Yahoo Sports, ESPN, Fox Sports, NFL.com, and MLB.com. One big part of fantasy sports is the ad revenue that these websites generate. In 2007, it was about $1.49 billion that was being spent on fantasy sports ads. By 2012, that number nearly doubled. It is now about $2.96 billion that is being spent on ads for fantasy sports. With regards to fantasy football, which we'll be diving into more in this presentation, there are three ways to pick players. The first and most important way is through the fantasy football draft. The draft is held at the beginning of the season, where each team gets to pick up their own players, the players that they feel that they might give them the best chance to win. There are usually anywhere from 13 to 16 rounds in this draft. Each team gets about 1 to 2 minutes to pick, and they have to pick a player for each of the active roster spots. Another way would be through free agency. Free agency is open all throughout the year, throughout the fantasy football season. This allows teams to pick up and drop players anytime that they like. Other teams can then pick up the players that other teams have dropped themselves. Players that are sought off after more usually go into the waiver wire. Waiver wire is the same as a free agency, but the player that is being picked goes in inverse order of standings. So if you're in last place, you get to pick up the player first in the waiver wire. The last way to pick up players is through trades. Teams are allowed to offer trades to other teams in the league. Once these trades are proposed, it is up to the other team to accept. If both teams accept the trade, at that point it goes to a league vote. It must be approved by 3 other members of the league for the trade to pass. This prevents any kind of unfair trades and keeps the competitiveness in the league. Again, the fantasy football draft is the most important aspect of fantasy football. This is a time that players get to build their entire team. Teams start from scratch usually, with no players. The top players get selected in the first few rounds, so it is vital that you secure a top selection in order to succeed in the league. Again, teams usually have 1 to 2 minutes to select a player that best fits their needs. There will be about 12 to 16 rounds. A player must be selected for each starting slot, and also a backup must be selected. There are 8 total active roster spots and 4 to 10 bench spots, depending on league preference. Here is an example of the Standard League Fantasy Football roster. The Standard League Fantasy Football roster will include 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 flex option. This allows the team to either play a wide receiver, a running back, or a tight end. There's also 1 tight end position, 1 kicker position, and 1 defense and special teams position. The defense and special teams position is a general defense. Teams select, for example, the Miami Dolphins defense. It is up, depending on how Miami Dolphins do on defense in the real sports and real NFL football. The scores are projected into the league, and the lesser points the Miami Dolphins football allow in real football, the more points you are able to score in the fantasy football. Most football fans shouldn't find it too hard to keep track of fantasy football scores. In front are the rules for fantasy football and how to score. A touchdown pass equals 4 points. Every 25 yards passing is 1 point. A 2-point conversion is 2 points. And if a player throws an interception, it is negative 2 points. For rushing, they receive 6 points for every touchdown they score, 1 point for every 10 yards they rush, and again, 2 points for every 2-point conversion. Receiving, a touchdown reception equals to 6 points, and like the rushing yards, every 10 receiving yards equals 1 point. Miscellaneous offense are kickoffs, punt returns, fumble recoveries, interception returns. A kickoff return equals 6 points. A punt return equals 6 points as well. A fumble recovery and an interception recovery for a touchdown equals 6 points. Here is an example of how defense and special teams score. This is standard league scoring. So a kickoff return equals 6 points, punt returns equals 6 points, interception returns equals 6 points, fumble recoveries for touchdowns equals 6 points, block punt or field goal for returns for touchdowns equals 6 points. Each interception is 2 points, fumble recoveries are 2 points, blocked punts or field goals are 2 points, safeties 2 points, sacks are 1 point. And if a team allows 0 points, they are scored in real life. They score 5 points in fantasy football. 1 to 6 points, they score 4 points. 7 to 13 points allowed, they score 3 points, and so on. For kicking, a field goal that's made past 50 yards, greater than 50 yards, scores 5 points. A field goal scored between 40 to 49 yards is 4 points. Between 0 to 39 yards is 3 points. Each extra point is 1 point. And any field goal missed deducts 1 point. A fantasy football season consists of 12 to 13 weeks, depending on league preference. Every week, there are head-to-head matchups. Teams go against each other, and the team that scores the most points that week wins their matchup. At the end of this regular season, the top 4 to 8 teams make the playoffs. The playoffs are usually the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season. There's only one champion, and the champion usually wins prize money or a trophy or both in many cases. I myself am an avid fantasy football player. And when I first started fantasy sports, I would play fantasy football, baseball, basketball. I would play all of them. But within the last few years, I began to focus only on fantasy football, since it's what I've been good at, and since what I enjoyed the most. Our league consists of 12 teams. We're a group of 12 close friends that gather together every year for the start of football season. We draft our players, and we begin the season. We watch many of the games together. It makes it more enjoyable. And unlike the traditional sports fan who only watches their favorite teams, fantasy sports players like myself watch almost all the games on all the football games in a given week, in hopes that we watch our players winning, in watching our players with hopes to win the league. We get bragging rights, trophy, and money. What more can you ask for?